How do we respond when others repeatedly cause harm, especially when it feels inescapable or out of our control? Buddhism teaches a practice of kindness and compassion, but does that mean accepting mistreatment? What do we do with situations like these? I had a recent question from a viewer of mine who asks, how does kindness practice, karma, and forgiveness fit into Buddhist ideas about responding to perpetual and habitual acts of harm? We all wrong others in a multitude of ways, but what does Buddhism say about individuals who consciously and deliberately repeat wrongdoing to others? What would a Buddhist do when it's impossible to escape habitual harmful wrongdoing imposed from another, just thinking about current events? In this video, we're going to discuss how Buddhist teachings on compassion, karma, and forgiveness apply to cases like these. We're going to ask how we can deal with such cases in a wise and compassionate manner without falling into spiritual bypassing, which I'll get to at the end. First, I think we should pay a little bit of attention to the Buddha's core teachings on responding to harm. The Buddha's attitude was that we should respond to harm with kindness and compassion. The power of the Buddha's message, indeed the most central place we find this message in its most powerful description, is in the Buddha's sutta on the parable of the saw. And this is what the Buddha said in that sutta. He says, even if low-down bandits were to sever you limb from limb with a two-handed saw, anyone who had a malevolent thought on that account would not be following my instructions. If that happens, you should train like this. Our minds will not degenerate. We will blurt out no bad words. We will remain full of sympathy, with a heart of love and no secret hate. We will meditate, spreading a heart of love to that person, and with them as a basis, we will meditate spreading a heart full of love to everyone in the world, abundant, expansive, limitless, free of enmity and ill will. That's how you should train. This is a profound and even a shocking teaching. It's also very, very hard to comply with. I mean, we have to be honest here. It's incredibly challenging to be able to practice in the way that the Buddha suggests we should. Most of us will not be able to live up to these kinds of standards. It seems absolutely normal and human to respond with anger, even hatred in this kind of situation. However, it's important to keep in mind that responding with kindness in the way that the Buddha suggests does not mean approving of harmful behavior, nor accepting it when it happens. It means that anger harms ourself much more than it harms the person that we're angry at. The Buddha has many, many instructions on the difficulties, the dangers, the pain involved in anger and hatred, and why anger and hatred should be avoided. In one early sutta, for example, the Buddha discusses many of the malevolent effects that anger can have upon us, resulting in such things as loss of sleep, loss of wealth, loss of reputation, friendships, and so on. As the 5th century scholar monk Buddhaghosa put it in his treatise, the Visuddhimagga, if you get angry, then maybe you make him suffer, maybe not, though with the hurt that anger brings, you certainly are punished now. So the starting point to our response to harm should be informed by this kind of wise awareness that while anger and hatred are absolutely natural and normal emotions to have in these kinds of situations, they're not helpful because they actually tend to amplify the harm done to ourselves. Second, when coming to a wise understanding of our response, what our response should be to harmful behavior, it's important to have at least a tiny bit of understanding as to why and how harmful behavior arises in other people. In the Buddha's understanding, harmful behavior arises in people in general because we are all trapped in these cycles of greed, of hatred, and of delusion. And often those who perpetuate this kind of harm and suffering on others do so because they themselves experience immense inner pain and suffering. One exercise we might undertake is to try to consider what somebody's inner world must be like, such that they cause such harm to other people. Now, I want to be clear here, this does not mean that we're excusing their harm, nor that we're tolerating it. It means that we're trying to soften our hearts somewhat so that we respond in a judicious manner to the harm in a way that doesn't involve so much anger and hatred on our own part. As Buddhaghosa says, there may be somebody that we know who has many harmful thoughts, speaks cruelly, and acts in ways that are harmful to people around them. In that case, he says, compassion for that person should be aroused. And this compassion is aroused through an awareness that these people are going to be the heirs to their own bad karma, or alternately, the fact that they're acting out this way right now is an indication that right now they are reaping the bad rewards of things that they've done in the past. That is, that their mind is so twisted through anger, hatred, greed, delusion, that they themselves are suffering to an extent that they distribute that suffering to people around them. Third, I want to touch a bit on what forgiveness means and doesn't mean in Buddhism. I did a recent video about this, so I'm not going to go into it in great detail. But in a nutshell, forgiveness in Buddhism does not mean letting the other person off the hook, nor absolving them in any way of whatever karmic burdens they may have undertaken on their own behalf. What it does mean is a practice for ourselves, giving up our own anger, our own resentment, our own wish for revenge in order to make our own lives better and suffer less. As the Buddha recommends in the Dhammapada, let us live so very happily, loving among the hostile. Among hostile people, let us live with love. In this sense, we forgive other people in order to free ourselves from the burden of hate and resentment, not to condone bad behavior, nor necessarily even to reconcile with somebody who has harmed us. And this leads us into our next point. Fourth, I think we should discuss a bit about boundaries and wise action. While the Buddha taught kindness and rejected cruelty, his was a kindness based upon strength, not upon avoidance. He never taught the passive acceptance of harm. He taught that we should do what we can to avoid harm. Indeed, in one famous example, the Buddha had a harmful monk forcibly removed from the Sangha so that the Sangha could continue in a way unperturbed or unmolested. Setting boundaries in this way is not an act of hatred, it's an act of compassion, kindness, and love for ourselves and those around us. Also, incidentally, acting in this way helps absolve or helps keep the person who is dangerous from actually creating more bad karma for themselves as well. So it can be an act of compassion even for the harmful person to set boundaries for them. Wise action should also fundamentally be based upon an understanding of the limitations of our own control. As we may know from much of the Buddha's teachings, we really lack complete control over anything. We certainly lack the control over other people's thoughts, their speech, and their actions. All that we have any control over, and even that is somewhat limited, is our own response to that speech and those actions. Fifth, I want to touch on the most difficult case, which is when we're faced with what seems to be inescapable harm. And this is the kind of case I think the Buddha was talking about in his parable or simile of the saw. In this difficult case, it may seem that there's nothing we can do, but there's always something that we actually can do, which is to focus on our practice. We can practice mindfulness. We can practice samadhi or concentration meditation in order to give ourselves an oasis of calm in what is otherwise a very bad situation. We can also, as the Buddha suggests, practice kindness or metta meditation in order to keep that kind of inner light of goodness from being extinguished. Perhaps most importantly, it's good to try to find your local community, people around you, friends, family, acquaintances, people at work, wherever it might be, who are on the same page, who you can congregate with, who you can seek help from. If it's necessary, it's also good to try to seek help from professionals if you're feeling depressed or anxious, particularly, and are not able to deal with them through meditation and through your ordinary activities. Seeking professional help as well can be extremely beneficial. It's important to realize for all of us that we are not alone. And of course, when possible, it's great to try to engage in compassionate action, seeking out justice where we can, helping people who are being affected badly in ways that we can, trying to engage without hatred, without malice, and with goodness in our heart. Now, these are very, very difficult instructions that the Buddha gives us. We have to be aware that we're not going to be able to live up to them all the time, or maybe even much of the time, but it's good at least to keep them in mind as a signpost, as a goal to achieve. But in all of this, it's very important not to engage in what I mentioned at the beginning, spiritual bypassing. This is a case where we think of ourselves in a more elevated light than we really find ourselves to be. That is to say, we pretend that we're not feeling what we actually are feeling. We pretend not to be angry when we really are angry. If we engage in this kind of bypassing, pretending to be ways that we aren't, covering up or repressing things that are coming up in our emotional life, we're only going to make it worse for us in the future. So it's good to be open and aware of whatever problematic states are arising within us, whether they be anger, greed, hatred, whatever they be, so that we can deal with them, so that we can be aware of them mindfully and non-judgmentally and work with them to make our lives better. Sixth, in conclusion, early Buddhism teaches kindness and compassion as a reaction to other people's harm. It teaches the drawbacks of anger and hatred and the benefits of kindness and compassion. But Buddhism does not teach passivity. It teaches us to react with wisdom as much as we can, grounded in an understanding and care for ourselves and other people. We may never be perfect at the Buddha's instructions in this regard, but any little act of kindness can make a difference in our own lives and the lives of the people around us. So my question for you is, how have you been able to react skillfully, kindly, compassionately to acts of harm that you've found in your own life? If you're interested in further discussion about this kind of issue of self-defense in early Buddhism, I have a video I did a while back, and I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like to see it again. Thanks so much. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing here. Thanks again, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.